Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming out. Today we are going to have Professor James Jacobs and Professor Jeffrey Parker who will comment. And Professor Jacobs is actually the head of the Center for Research in Crime and Justice, and he's a professor at NYU Law. He taught at Cornell Law previously, and he has a JD and a PhD from the University of Chicago. And he is very widely published. This is actually coming out soon, his new book on breaking the devil's pact. And I think our library is going to get a copy. And Professor Parker, some of you may have had him. He teaches evidence and civil procedure, but he's also teaches criminal law sometimes as well. And he received his JD from the University of Virginia. And he was also a senior fellow at the Goldwater Institute and did work on the U.S. Sentencing Commission. And he's also widely published. He kind of does it all and still litigates. And he's a great mentor, too, and professor. I had him for evidence and civil procedure. So join me in welcoming our speakers today.
Thank you very much, Ashley, and thank you all for coming, and special thanks to Professor Parker for taking time to come and participate in this. So we only have an hour, and I would like to leave a lot of time for your reactions and your questions. So I'll try to just give you some talking points, what's been interesting to me. I've been working on various aspects of labor racketeering off and on since the late 1980s. I started in this when as a consultant to the New York State Organized Crime Task Force, which was working on an investigation of the construction industry in New York. It was well known that the construction industry had been very deeply penetrated by the mafia throughout the 20th century. It wasn't some kind of digging up deep secrets. I mean, it was very much on the surface. Anybody who did construction in New York, which was everybody, right? So either a developer or a contractor or a supplier, understood that the mafia played a major role. And yet, it's one of these things that everybody knows, and yet people don't know. Like people like shocked at how could this be? The situation that penetration of the construction industry was primarily, I would say at its core, it was through the construction unions. So maybe 50 or 60 construction unions, and almost 100% of them were substantially influenced or controlled by the five families in New York. And that's true of construction in a lot of American cities and many other industries. So when I finished that, I started looking at the general issue of organized crime and organized labor. It is not really much written about or much talked about. And in fact, you could read a standard 2-volume history of American labor movement and not find any entry on organized crime. And so I leave that with you to think about. I mean, how can that be? How can the people who do labor history tell a history of the labor movement without reference to and without discussing and analyzing the very significant role that organized crime families have had in the evolution, the growth, and the demise of the American labor movement. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary. And then if you turn your attention to labor law and to the labor law case books, as I have done and looked at them, the subject of labor racketeering isn't mentioned. It doesn't get into the labor law case books. It's not in the curriculum. Labor law professors really don't know about it, or if they know about it, they somehow block it from their minds, which I still, to this day, I really can't understand that. So this book that I've just published, Breaking the Devil's Pact, is about the government's civil RICO suit against the Teamsters Union. It was brought in 1988 by Rudy Giuliani. It was a civil RICO suit that alleged that the ruling, the governing body of the Teamsters Union in Washington, the General Executive Board and its president at that time, Jackie Presser, were in an alliance with the heads of the mafia families. In fact, Jackie Presser had been designated and appointed, really, as head of the Teamsters Union by the heads of the families together and campaigning. They had different candidates and so forth. They worked out who would be the head of the Teamsters Union, and then that was ratified by the General Executive Board. So that's a pretty heavy allegation when you're talking about, at that time, the largest private sector union in the United States, to be one out of maybe 15%, as much as 20% of all unionized workers in the private sector, members of the Teamsters Union. So you would think this would be a pretty big case. It was politically a big case because before it was filed, there were rumors that it was in the works in the Justice Department, and 280 members of Congress delivered a petition to the Attorney General of the United States, Edwin Meese, at that time, exhorting Meese and the Justice Department not to bring a suit against the Teamsters Union because it would be a blow to a free and democratic labor movement. This after decades of prosecutions of labor racketeering in the Teamsters, of all kinds of hearings and exposés and movies. I mean, this wasn't like, what? There's organized crime in the Teamsters Union? I mean, and yet you've got 280 members of Congress willing to put their names on a petition saying that a lawsuit to eradicate organized crime in the Teamsters Union would be a blow to a free and democratic labor movement. So, I mean, something is going on here. Something is very amiss in our politics and academia and so forth. So I've been on a kind of one-man crusade for quite some time to try to get this subject up on the radar screen. I started writing about it back in the late 80s, as I say. This is really my 5th book about the government's attack on organized crime. Not all of those books are about labor racketeering, but there is got to be a labor part in all of that writing. And in all of that time, I have not generated any interest among labor law professors or labor studies. The only interest on the criminal law side, which I suppose is okay because that's what I work on. But it just amazes me. This case that I've just written about has generated maybe 1,000 written opinions by the district courts and the circuit courts. It generated one All Writs Act opinion, which was perhaps the most wide-ranging All Writs Act opinion in the history of the United States. It's generated a kind of monitorship, a court-appointed monitorship over the Teamsters Union, which is unprecedented. It's incredible. It's imposed a nationwide one-person, one-vote, rank-and-file election on the Teamsters to choose their international officers. No other unions does that. Perhaps there's no private election, probably no private election in the United States of that magnitude. I mean, it goes on all over the U.S. and Canada. 1.5 million potential voters in a mail ballot election. With people trying to campaign all around the United States. I mean, this is an amazing experiment in systemic reform and in union democracy. and it's not in the labor law case books. So the issue is joined for me with my labor law colleagues. I said this is the most important labor litigation of the last 50 years. I mean, trying to eradicate the influence of organized crime on the nation's most powerful and largest, most populous union, and the case has gone on for 22 years, 5 administrations, and so forth. I mean, this is an amazing case. 500 officers of the Teamsters Union have been expelled from the union by the court-appointed officers in charge of the disciplinary apparatus that came out of the consent decree, and it doesn't deserve a mention in the labor law case book. Well, I'm almost out of my 15 minutes. Organized crime benefited tremendously over the 20th century from its influence in the labor movement. It gave organized crime political status, so that they stayed as people who were involved in the labor movement. Some of them were actually labor officials and mob organized crime people at the same time, so that they sat at the table of power, in cities and regionally and even nationally. Even when they themselves were not the labor officials, they were pulling the strings, the puppet strings of labor officials, so they had tremendous political influence from this penetration of the labor movement. And they also extracted a lot of money, both from the unions and from the unions' pension and welfare funds. And as some of you may know, for a period of years, the Teamsters, the biggest pension and welfare fund, the Central States Pension and Welfare Fund, which itself has generated litigation over maybe 25 years, really functioned as a mafia bank in the United States, and was there to make loans and to finance mafia investments. This kind of labor racketeering has obvious effects on unions and on the union movement. The incumbents shared in the bounty, so that they made money by in their cooperation with organized crime. They took a share of the bribes and of the embezzlements and all of the corrupt payments, and they also were politically supported in the unions by organized crime, so that they really couldn't be opposed. People who opposed the setup, so-called dissidents, labor dissidents. There's a wonderful story to be told about labor dissidents and why they're not more of a civil liberties issue in the United States than they are. But people who objected, they were blacklisted. Union would call up an employer and say, you should fire Smith, and by the way, you won't get any union grievance about it. We find that he's really not very cooperative, and that things would go better with us if you fire him. And so the dissidents would be fired. If that wasn't successful, they could be physically dealt with as well. I think this had a very big effect on the American labor movement. I'm a criminal law guy, so I'm not that well read in labor literature, but reasonably well read. I've never come across an author who is writing about American labor who attributes the mafia penetration of the labor movement as one of the factors that has led to the decline of the American labor movement. I've seen long lists of factors, from globalization to technology and so forth and so on. Improvements in fighting labor unions by lawyers and so. But I've never seen anyone even mention as a factor the penetration of the labor movement extensively by mafia figures. That strikes me as totally implausible. given that the unions I've looked at, so many of the people that are running the union and who are employed in the union are mob people and their friends and their girlfriends and so on. They have no expertise as labor officials, right? If you could have replaced all of them with vigorous, dynamic labor activists, we would have had a very different labor movement. Not to mention the fact that they take bribes in order to sell out the rank and file. So that is what labor racketeering is. It is the selling of the rights and interests of the rank and file to the employer. The employer pays to buy up those contract rights. So when you read about this is the contract, isn't it lovely? That contract doesn't function in practice. It only sets the parameters of the marketplace for selling off the provisions of the contract. So I remember a discussion I had with the court-appointed officer in the laborers union of North America, LIUNA, right? It's a big union of laborers, and he was came to New York and he was looking at asbestos removal, and he said, our union, he spoke of it as our union, he's a former prosecutor, he's the monitor, he said, our union has jurisdiction over asbestos removal. So, I go to a site, our people should be, removing the asbestos. He says, the best I can tell, about 10% of asbestos removal in New York is being done by members of LIUNA. 90% is being done by non-union workers. Why is that? It's a contract, right? Don't they enforce the contract? Aren't there people from LIUNA demanding, and picketing? And so, no, there aren't. They're taking bribes, right? That's how it works. And that's how it works in many industries. All right, I think that's a taste of what I've been doing. And I'll leave it to Professor Parker.
Thanks. I wanted to add my thanks to Professor Jacobs for visiting with us. I have to admit, I was not previously familiar with his work. And as I said to Ms. Finnegan, I'm no labor expert either, far from it. Nonetheless, I took the occasion to look at some of his papers. And I found this is kind of an interesting but overlooked subject, and one that I think I can come to from perhaps a useful perspective and raise some questions. My background is more from the corporate side. I was a practicing lawyer in New York for many years, and one of my questions, this is a minor question, may or may not want to ask it, is in addition to the construction business, it was always generally believed that the trash collection business also was completely mobbed up. And so I was wondering if that was through the unions as well. Right. But I guess my sort of way to go about this is to step back a little bit. And one of the questions that Professor Jacobs raises is, can this sort of approach of working through RICO, which I hope most of you know, it stands for Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. And when you look back at it from his point of view, you can see in the structure of RICO, which you'll all have occasion to encounter, by the way, whether you like it or not. And in my experience, again, coming from the corporate side, none of the cases I had, in civil RICO had anything to do with labor racketeering, but rather with sort of garden variety fraud. But when you look at it from that point, from the labor racketeering point of view, you can see that some of the influences in the otherwise curious constructions in this statute that you might not understand were motivated, I think, in part by trying to get at this problem of labor racketeering, which had been a recognized problem in America. Now, I, together with many others in criminal law and civil law, probably would favor repealing RICO at the moment, or at least civil RICO, and maybe criminal RICO too. But, maybe Professor Jacobs' work gives me pause. Maybe we should keep at least RICO low, right? Corrupt labor organizations, because this is part of what Congress had in mind. Now, the general question is whether this approach of suing civilly in order to, in effect, obtain monitors to try to clean up these organizations that have been penetrated by gangsters is, I think, it has another parallel with the corporate world, which I think is useful perhaps to pursue. And it's a little newer than labor, but it might be something to learn, and this is in the context of the federal sentencing guidelines for corporate offenders, which in theory could include labor unions, but rarely do. The unions themselves are rarely prosecuted as such, as are business corporations. But in that context, there has been fairly extensive use of a similar type of structure, in certain cases, creating monitors to sort of oversee the corporation. And there's some similar things that have been done previously by the Securities and Exchange Commission with broker-dealer firms and so on, as a way of sort of like an injunctive form of relief against miscreant or at least corrupted organizations, even if themselves are not evil. Now, our experience, of course, with this type of thing in the corporate world is mostly negative, but may be the result of the factors that differentiate business corporations from labor unions in terms of both their structure and their operations, which again leads me to this more general question I'd like to see some discussion on, is just how would one define success in this context? I know that Professor Jacobs has tried to raise that question, proposed that maybe there should be research funding applied to that question of trying to develop means. And again, I haven't seen his latest work, but he may have some answers there. But in thinking about this, it made me think about what is it that's different, maybe, between labor organizations and other organizations in terms of perhaps their vulnerability to penetration by racketeers or racketeering. Now, I'm not carrying any grief for business corporations and that they're especially virtuous organizations, and they have their problems and so on. But it is, I think, generally believed that they might be less vulnerable. They may be vulnerable to internal pathologies of sorts, but they're less vulnerable to this kind of outside racketeer penetration. And the question you might want to ask yourself is why? If it's true, why is it true? And if it is true, then maybe we could learn something that would allow us to, instead of trying to go back ex post, solve this problem by putting a monitor in place to throw out the gangsters and try to create a more democratic union. And let me just drop a footnote on that, especially for you nascent Federalists out there. Democracy is not a panacea. You can have a very democratic union structure with elections and so forth, and still Jimmy Hoffa gets elected every time. And there is an inherent advantage to incumbency. And again, look at the general government if you want to see the pathologies of democratic structures. So it's not necessarily true that success, I mean, my general question is, what is success here? I'm not sure that success is simply creating a more democratic or apparently democratic election structure. And this is, I think, raised some interesting theoretical questions. I mean, again, the elections theorists will show that democracy rarely leads to a result that could even be considered rational, much less optimal. And the more heterogeneous the electorate, the less rational the result. That's the result popularly known as Arrow's theorem, or in a simplified form, the Condorcet paradox. But that's a problem that you think would be less severe in labor organizations, that they have a more homogeneous set of interests, one would presume. And yet that's not apparently what we observe. And so that is another particular on the generality that democracy is not a panacea. So my general inquiry here, my last sort of area of inquiry, is what could perhaps we do to inoculate labor organizations against future racketeering penetration. And in that regard, I want to suggest a sort of a hypothesis that maybe the problem is not in the particulars of given labor organizations or given parts of the country. Maybe it's in the structure of the labor policy more generally. Now, part of it, of course, is organizational form. Labor unions, again, one of the things that polices corruption in the corporate level is the market for corporate control, right? We have similar problems of stealing from the pension fund and so forth in corporate and business corporations. Quite common problems, but that's policed by the market for corporate control, which we don't have in labor unions, and indeed it's somewhat worse than that. The whole premise of the labor policy in the United States seems to be trying to foster a situation of bilateral monopoly. That is to say, the whole notion of the bargaining unit, the collective bargaining unit, that gets certified and sets off its monopoly power against the presumed power of the employer. Now, what that leads to is a situation that I think is generally conducive to coercion. That is to say that members of the union are often put in a position where they have to sort of go along with the bargaining unit whether they want to or not. In some states, they have to contribute financially to the bargaining unit under a union shop situation. And therefore, make with or without voting rights. And so, I think part of the problem here is that coercion is to some extent built in. Coercion and extortion are to some extent built into the labor policy of the United States. Now, I would argue that all of this is predicated on sort of 19th century ideas of labor and management. You know, laborers versus capitalists, and there's a lot of Marshall imagery used here, strikes, labor peace, strike breaking. I mean, it's a sort of a Marshall analogy, and that may be out of date. And maybe the solution to a lot of these problems is simply to try to foster competition among labor organizations themselves. For example, I mean, the norm, as I understand it, I'm not a labor specialist either. The norm, as I understand it, is you get a bargaining unit defined by reference to either a company or a trade or something like this, which seems to create this norm of bilateral monopoly. But it seems to me that the economies of labor organization are sufficient to allow labor unions to exist without that. They apparently think they have to have that, but I don't think so, because there should be economies of scale in the idea of collective bargaining without having to worry about the free rider problem of other workers. And one could imagine a world in which you have mixed situations, where you have some union workers and some non-union workers in the same industry, in the same jurisdiction. Why not? What's wrong with that? And that would seem to help discipline, create some of the discipline of competition, apply that to the labor organizations, which may help to inoculate them somewhat against this problem of racketeering. Because I think the whole idea of coercion is contagious and attracts the type of people who like to employ it, which is, after all, a partial definition of what labor racketeering really is. That's all I have.
All right, we're going to open it up for questions. Yeah.
We're talking about the federal government trying to break up or at least check unions through RICO, but it seems to me that if organized crime gets most of its leverage through intimidation, wouldn't secret ballots as opposed to card checking be a better option for trying to weed out the organized crime influence?
I would think so.
But then the federal government, I believe the Employers Free Choice Act, it's an amendment to the NLRA, seems to be favoring card check and preemption. Even states that are going towards secret ballot legislation seem to be being pushed back through preemption.
Yeah, I think that's right, and that's what the heads of unions want, and they think it will help them with their organizing.
So do you see most of this pushback coming from the federal side, or do the states seem to be looking more towards trying to limit the union power?
Well, I think that, obviously this comes from the unions, right? The unions are pushing for this, and therefore the Democratic Party is pushing for it, right? And sometimes I think people underestimate the residual power of the labor movement. So I think that's the politics of it. The Republicans are opposed to it. Most of them are opposed to it. I think that if you have secret ballots, you have a better chance of defeating corrupt candidates. But it's certainly not a panacea, as Professor Parker said. And one of the things I say in my book is even when you had this breakthrough and this 22-year-long case, and you have a nationwide rank-and-file secret ballot election, in the 2006 Teamster election, only 19% of the union members bothered to send their ballots in. Right. Only 19% sent their ballots. All you had to do was mark the ballot and put it in the mail. You didn't have to come to the polls or anything. And only 19% bothered to fill it in. So, this tells me that there's overwhelming indifference. And in fact, not only overwhelming indifference, but there was no question about the fact that some of these mobsters and gangsters were popular in their locals and in their unions. And so when the government came in and said, we're here to help you, we're here to liberate you, it was in a way like the liberation of Iraq. Right? We're here to liberate you. We thought people would be on the streets with flowers, and you had a lot of resistance among the rank and file. We don't want the government here. They really a lot of ignorance about what goes on within the union, right. And then also some intimidation and some fear.
I just had a question about the relationship between the mob and the unions, because at some points I'm not sure if it's symbiotic. Like you mentioned how the union they used the retirement accounts basically as a loan operation for different mob operations.
Yeah.
So was the mob actually part of the union? Like, was this their day job that they put on the resume? Like, I'm like a member of this union, or was it more of the union would help the mob would help the union, and they were separate?
Well, sometimes there were mobsters who had two hats. They were made members of the mafia and they were officers of unions, sometimes very high-level officers of unions, like Tony Anastasio, who was the head of the Longshoremen's Association, and at times was mentioned as a candidate for Secretary of Labor. He was a capo, in one of the New York families, right? But more often, and sometimes the mobsters just had no-show jobs with the union. They were an organizer, or they were something or other, but they never showed up, so they didn't. They just got a paycheck. Sometimes they ran supply companies, and the unions always took their supplies from them. Sometimes they were consultants. Sometimes they were labor consultants. Some of these labor racketeers, and they got money from employers as labor consultants. as well as from unions, but mostly from the employers. But on the pension and welfare funds, the pension and welfare funds are there for the benefit of the workers. And so the employers, historically, on these joint employer union funds, right, they're administered by half the trustees appointed by the employer and half by the union. But the employers really took a passive role, like this is what the union, the union represents the employees, and if this is what they want, then, we don't stand in their way, and the employee representatives, at least in the Teamsters case, did the bidding of organized crime. Right? That doesn't mean that they were organized crime. They were union officials, but they were union officials who took their instructions from organized crime figures. Right? And often got payoffs, but there was also a testimony in various cases and so on, and people were told, we'll kill you and your family and so forth. I mean, there was always a threat, and it's very hard in dealing with organized crime to often distinguish between threats and bribes, extortion and bribery, right? People take payoffs, right? And things go better, right? But is there a threat? It's always there when you deal with the mafia as implicit, right? It's always an implicit threat.
I see an interesting parallel between what you're studying and the treatment within the general labor discourse on human trafficking for labor. Because it's old organized crime, which is Italian organized crime, that's been involved in labor and controlling the labor force. While a lot of the human trafficking for labor today is found in agriculture in New York State or in Florida or elsewhere is controlled by new groups of organized crime, Mexicans, others. And yet there is also a failure to integrate this discussion of exploitation of labor and organized crime involvement in it. I was just, I'm a Cornellian too, and I was recently having a discussion with people from the Industrial Labor Relations School. There's not one textbook, there's no classes that talk about this problem of labor involvement and exploitation of labor.
And is labor union involved?
What?
Is it labor unions that are involved?
No, but this is exploitation of labor done by organized crime. And there are cases that have been prosecuted, and there's no textbooks. There's nobody that's treating this issue.
I hadn't thought about that. And my work has been very much focused on unions.
Right.
And the way in which unions are exploiting their rank and file. So that the victims of this kind of racketeering are the rank and file. Sometimes people think about labor racketeering as victimizing the employers, right? Shaking down the employers and taking payoffs from the employers. There is some of that, but in general, the victims are the workers who don't get the jobs that they should be because the union bosses are taking payoffs, right, not to enforce their contracts. And the employers are the ones that are paying the payoffs. So the employers are passing money to the union bosses. Is it extortion or is it bribery? Most of the time, at least in the areas that I'm looking at, it's bribery. They get something for it. Therefore, there has never been a concerted business outrage about the mafia-penetrated labor movement in the U.S. It's gone on for 80 years. It's never been a circumstance that I know of the business community saying this has got to stop. Someone has got to do something. I mean, they have learned to live with it in those industries where it exists. Right? In fact, when I was working with the New York State Organized Crime Task Force and we wanted to talk to developers and contractors about this problem, they were not interested in talking to us. What problem? they didn't see a problem, right? They had learned to live with it. And by the way, the Labor Council of New York, you know, the umbrella organization, the AFL-CIO organization that represents the interests of labor generally, wouldn't even meet with us. I mean, they wouldn't even meet with us. We're talking, and then, you know, in fact, often I've been called anti-labor, which I don't get. I mean, I'm talking about the infiltration of the labor movement by organized crime. I mean, this isn't something I dreamed up. I mean, everybody knows that this is the case, and this is the exploitation of workers. I mean, how is this anti-labor? I mean, it's anti-labor racketeering for sure, but I mean, how could it be anti-labor? We would have a much healthier labor movement if there was no organized crime influence there, no corruption there. Some of the Professor Parker said a lot of very interesting and provocative things. We could have a whole course, you know, in all the different topics that he opened up. I wish I had time to comment on all of those.
This question's for either of you, maybe Professor Parker can chime in as well. I'm wondering about the difference between the regulatory structure for corporations and businesses compared to the regulatory structure for labor unions. My instinct is that business is far more regulated than labor unions.
Well, that's absolutely the case. It's just what Professor Parker said. And there are gatekeepers there looking at businesses. Take the SEC, for example, which is supposed to be a regulator and investigator and brings charges and so forth. I mean, there's no one out there that is similar to the SEC looking at labor unions, and there should be. Certainly one of my recommendations.
Well, there is, as you point out, I think in some of your writings, there is for ERISA, might be explained in part, as motivated by the problems of corruption in the labor.
ERISA was motivated by that.
Right, but that's not, that only addresses one part of the problem, and arguably not the most important part, which is just the regular stealing, which, you know.
Well, and ERISA is enforced by the Department of Labor. So you could say, well, the Department of Labor should be there, but the Department of Labor has always been co-opted by the labor unions themselves. So the Labor Department, you know, rarely would take a stand that was not. They're more like the Chamber of Commerce, you know, for business. I mean, they're not a real
well,
regulator.
and there would be serious problems with having like an SEC for labor, which is sort of a contentious regulatory relationship, at least in theory, because of First Amendment issues that labor people would raise, right? That too heavy a hand of regulating unions would encroach on their association rights.
Well, that's certainly what Jackie Presser said about the use of civil RICO. He made that same point. He said that's what the kind of thing that goes on in Russia, where the government comes in to take over unions and regulate unions. And what is Giuliani doing? He's a tool of the Reagan administration. You know, these are what the Republicans want to do. They're going to take over and destroy free and democratic labor unions, right? And this is Jackie Presser. He's a mob guy. When he's not being an informer for the FBI. Yeah, sure they would say that. And they talked about their associational rights, and when the case was brought, they challenged it on associational grounds.
Well, I would be interested in your reaction to my partial solution to that, which is make labor more competitive within itself.
So that they wouldn't have exclusive bargaining rights.
Right.
Yeah, but I mean, that would go to the heart of reconstituting the whole of labor relations. So,
but maybe that's where the problem is.
And maybe that is. And maybe that is.
Okay, one last question.
It seems to me that public sector unions have avoided this problem. If that's true, why is that?
Well, I mean, there have been a lot of corrupt public sector unions as well, and the subject of labor corruption, you know, it kind of is a subset of mafia penetration of the labor movement. Right? I mean, you have many corrupt unions that are not corrupted by the mafia. Right? You can have teachers' unions that are corrupt because the people that run it are corrupt and are stealing from it, right? And you can have other kinds of public sector. We had a big public sector union in New York, AFSCME, local 30, I think it was local 30, and there were dozens of prosecutions. I mean, people just looting the union. But in general, you have a different kind of a setup. I mean, you don't have the government as the employer paying off the union people bribes. You know, they pay them in different ways. You know, they pay contracts, right? So even the rank and file benefit. So you have a different, different kind of setup in the public sector. So
but there's sometimes, I mean, there's this dispute recently. I don't know if you got involved in this, but one of the payoff methods was comp time, or whatever they call that, where the leaders of the public unions got lots, very generous allowances of time they could spend working on.
I didn't see that. And then
so that's another form
and
of
it's
pay.
a way that
maybe it's a little more
that they would make fewer demands on the public union.
That's the idea.
I think it'd be that's traditionally and historically, the mafia did not become involved in the public sector, unions.
All right, if you want to sign up for an interview time, come see me after. And I'd like to thank Professor Jacobs and Professor Parker for coming out tonight.
Thank you all.